guys, this is Jerningham here. Just going for the health thing at the moment. It says the health announcement: 359 additional deaths of people who were tested positive for Corona-19. So this guy's speaking about the deaths. Across all UK settings, total numbers 39,728. This guy's on about if you're coughing with coronavirus symptoms, use your tissue and dispose of it, man.
You don't pass that on. And something which, again, we brought in relatively recently, the idea that if you cannot socially distance at 2 metres for a prolonged period, moderately prolonged period, then you should use face cloths, and that's one of the things which is a new thing. So those are going to carry on really for as long as this epidemic continues. But then we've got the group of things which are around trying to break the link between households, because that is where most of the social distancing come in, and those are the things that were absolutely essential. Trying to reduce people's social contacts, including close friends and family, because actually very often those are the people who you will catch this from. All the things which bring people together, the things we all enjoy, like pubs, clubs, and restaurants and so on, these are things where we needed to close those down. Shops were closed down as a way of ensuring that you came into contact with as few people who were from different households. And of course, the initial large but not complete closure of schools. Now, in this group of things, we've really made very, very small changes, with the exception of the schools, which has been a small additional group to the people already at schools, the children with essential workers. Almost all the other things are to do with people meeting outdoors and asked to be socially distant. And that's because the risk of people being outdoors is very considerably reduced. But these are really modest and slow steps. And the final two things that we have to do is shielding, making sure that the people who are at greatest risk are away from the greatest risk of meeting others with the virus. And we've made a very small adjustment to that, which is, again, because for many people this was incredibly difficult to maintain, to say, well, if you're just with a member of your existing household, you can go outdoors, or you can meet someone, but at a distance, only one person, outdoors only. These changes in risk are really very small. And then the final one, which really is important to stress, because it is in the long run, the way we're going to get ourselves out of this, is research. Finding new drugs, finding new vaccines. Now, the reason I've listed all of those out is, what we're making is small adjustments to some of these things, but this is a multi-layered defence, and all of us have parts to play in almost all of these. It's absolutely critical we all do this. And so we shouldn't take the fact that small adjustments are being made now to imply that this is suddenly lockdown over. What this is a slight reversal of some of the most onerous things on people, mainly outdoors, at a socially safe distance, the 2 metre distance. So I know that's a long answer, but I think it is important to put things in context rather than just to see them as one-off events.
Thanks very much. Robert, Tom Newton-Dunn from The Sun.
Thank you, Prime Minister. Question first to the CMO and the CSA, if they could possibly both answer this one. Testing capacity, we know track and trace is up and running. Could you say at what capacity it currently now is at? Is it 20%, 50%, 100%? We know it's not 100% maybe. And when do you expect it to be running at full capacity, full operating capacity? And before it gets to that stage, since Angela McCain has been very clear that having a fully operating track and trace system is crucial to unlocking the lockdown, are you comfortable for more measures to be released, such as the opening of shops or pubs or restaurants? And question to the Prime Minister. Prime Minister, this is my last question to you as the Sun's political editor. It's now clear that the nation will lose a whole load of jobs. Many millions of jobs may be lost by the autumn, by Christmas. Many of those will be Sun readers, probably tens or even hundreds of thousands. Are you able to guarantee to these people, none of whom have lost their jobs through any fault of their own, either new jobs to all of them, or if not, help or training to all of them to be able to get new jobs again?
Yes, sorry. Why don't you answer the first one? I'll come to it.
On the testing capacity, in a sense, what we've done is play leapfrog to some extent. The capacity goes up, then we run to catch up. There are very many more things we could do with testing with greater capacity. And the key thing we need to do is do that systematically. We obviously started off with people who had severe disease, went out by stages, key workers, testing them if they had symptoms so they could go back to work in the NHS, social care and other areas. And we've now got to a situation where we can test people who've got symptoms in the general public, and that allows us to run the NHS test and trace system, which was not possible when we had less testing capacity. But the more capacity we have, the more different uses we can use for these testing for people who've got the virus now. And that allows us to do screening, for example, in care homes, screening in hospitals, and other things which will allow us to find the hotspots that we've got in terms of infection and deal with them. But you're absolutely right. We are not yet at sort of cruising altitude for this. The number of tests is going to carry on going up. And our ability to use the tests we've got is going to carry on going up. And this is going to carry on for quite some time before we get to the point, I think, that we're all satisfied we've got to the point we need. There's the additional point, which I'm not going to go into the details of unless you really want to on a follow-up, of antibody testing, which is an additional capacity we now have. And this can say reliably whether someone has had the infection several weeks ago, but we don't know whether it tells us anything useful about immunity or anything of that sort. But that's the other form of testing. And we're increasing the ability to do both of those across the UK.
And just to add to that, what Angela said is that an effective system in place is an important part of going forward, is an important part of being able to release measures, and as Chris has said, it's being built up. But I do want to stress, it's not the single answer. So the idea that somehow having a test and trace system in containment absolves ourselves of all the other things we need to do is incorrect. We need to make sure that we carry on with the distancing and some of the other measures in place in order to control this. The lower the number of cases in the country, the more effective and the higher burden of load, as it were, can be carried by test and trace and making sure people isolate. But on its own, it's not the answer. It has to be part of the whole system.
And Tom, on your incredibly important point about what's going to happen as we as the months go by and the effect of this recession starts to bite. Yeah, and let's be in no doubt, of course, I'm afraid, tragically, there will be many job losses, and that is just inevitable because of the effect of this virus on the economy and because of the shutdown that has taken place. And all I can say is that in dealing with that fallout from coronavirus, we will be as activist and as interventionist as we have been throughout the lockdown. There's no other country in the world, I think, has done as much, or few others that have done as much as the UK in terms of putting our arms around workers with the furlough scheme, looking after companies that have run into difficulties, helping in any way that we can. We will be just as interventionist in the next phase, investing in the UK economy, investing in infrastructure, taking our country forward so that we bounce back as sharply and as decisively as we can. That's going to be our approach. One thing I want to say is that for young people in particular, for whom the risk is, I think, highest of losing jobs and then being out of work for a long time, I think it's going to be vital that we guarantee apprenticeships for young people. I think we must have a huge, we have to look after people across the board, but young people in particular, I believe, should be guaranteed an apprenticeship. Thank you. I didn't let anybody else back, Tom. I'll be accused of favoritism, but everybody's going to wish you well on your next job and after your historic innings as political editor of The Sun. Steve Swinford of The Times.
Prime Minister, China's role in this pandemic has been heavily criticised, and you personally raised concerns on our pages this morning about the impact of security laws in Hong Kong. Do you think we can ever return to business as normal with China, and are you, as is being reported, now looking to remove Huawei from Britain's 5G network entirely from 2023? And so, Patrick, just a brief question to come back from what Tom was saying earlier. You seem to suggest that SAGE previously provided advice on the impact of quarantine measures. Did SAGE provide specific advice on implementing those measures on June the 8th, as is being planned, and whether that would doing so would actually make a significant difference to the spread of coronavirus? And if it didn't, do you personally have a view on that?
Well, first of all, on Hong Kong, I've said what I've said, which is that you're absolutely right, Steve. I do think that what is happening now is potentially going to be an infringement of the Sino-UK, Sino-British Agreement of 1987. It protects political and civic freedoms in Hong Kong. That looks as though it could be very, very badly eroded by what is being proposed. And so what we're saying is that we want to hold out our hand, a hand of friendship and support and loyalty to the people of Hong Kong. I think that's the right thing to do on high-risk vendors in our critical national infrastructure. You know my views. I think we've got to make sure that we have solutions for the UK that protect UK security, and that's what this government is going to achieve. But I want to stress one thing. I am a Sinophile. I think China is an incredible country and an extraordinary civilization, and I deeply disapprove of anti-Chinese xenophobia, attacks on people of Chinese appearance that we've seen in recent months. We must stamp out such xenophobia, and I see absolutely no contradiction between what I've said earlier about Hong Kong and about high-risk vendors in critical national infrastructure, and wanting a good, friendly, clear-eyed working relationship with China, and that's what this country will have.
Again, I'll reiterate the advice that the experts from SAGE gave, which is that the measures at the border are most effective when the incidence is very low in this country and when applied to countries which have higher incidence. And the judgment of that time, of course, is not something for us, it's something for politicians to make, and they make the policy and they make the timing decisions. But that's the advice that we gave in terms of the science of this.
Thanks very much. Thank you. Can we go now to Josh Layton from the Coventry Evening Telegraph?
To the Prime Minister, coronavirus has already taken a bigger toll on the UK than anywhere else in Europe. What specific reassurances can you give workers in Coventry, especially in the car manufacturing sector, which you've been so keen to champion, that they won't suffer the worst economic fallout as well? And to Professor Whitty and Sir Patrick, many parents in Coventry and Warwickshire are telling us that they are refusing to send their children back to school at the moment. With everything we have heard this evening about the alert level and the prospect of local lockdowns, doesn't this cautious approach prove them right?
Well, first of all, on Josh, on your question about what we're doing to support the Coventry and the West Midlands, a huge number of businesses have received grant payments, about 42 million, I think, in Coventry alone. We're supporting businesses in industry enterprise in the West Midlands, and I think 85% of eligible businesses in Coventry and the West Midlands have received funding. But just, you mentioned the car sector. One thing we really want to drive forward as we come out of the epidemic, as we bounce back, I want to see a lot more going into green technology, green batteries, green motor vehicles, low carbon motor vehicles of all kinds. And we have, for instance, we've just put 108 million into the UK Battery Industrialisation Centre, which is due to open later this year. So the West Midlands was the home of the original automotive revolution. That's where it all began, the internal combustion engine. And it's already in the West Midlands, you're seeing an incredible profusion of brilliant low-carbon technology, low-carbon vehicles. That's what we want to champion. That's the future.
I mean, on children, on parents not wanting to send their children to school, which I think anyone can understand why parents are thinking about this very hard. I'm going to give an answer in the way you would give an answer as a doctor, which is to say, if you're starting a drug, if you're recommending an operation, if you're doing anything of that sort, you say, look, there are some things that are benefits and there are some things that are risks, and you've got to understand these, and you've got to understand when is the right time, where the risks and benefits have some form of balancing out. And of course, and this is not my area of expertise, I'm making the general point, children not having their school education is a huge disadvantage to them potentially for the rest of their lives. Everyone would, I think, broadly accept that. Set against that are the downsides of going to school in an epidemic. And I think that I'm going to list out four. The first of which is the risk to children. I think that one of the things that is one of the few reassurances that we can give in this disease is that overall it looks as if children are much less likely than adults to get severe disease and probably less likely to get clinical disease, meaning symptoms of any sort. Although there are tragically a very small number of deaths in children and a slightly larger number of people who've had severe disease compared to adults, this is not a dangerous disease in the way that many other infections really pick out children. This disease does not. So this is not a disease which is primarily of risk to children. The second thing is that parents of particularly primary school children are generally not in the age group which is at high risk of getting severe problems with coronavirus. Now, there are people who've got particular high-risk medical conditions who are shielded at the moment, and in that situation there's a different set of concerns, and there's very specific guidance for those parents. But this is not an area in primary school, but a very small proportion of parents of primary school children are in the age group where there's high mortality or severe problems. Clearly, there is a very complicated balancing act for society in terms of the possibility of increasing the transmission and on the one hand, and depriving children of their education on the other. And this is a very hard balancing act, but this is where we're trying to, as a society, walk between two risks, a risk to education and a risk to health. And the rates of transmission are now much lower than they were at the point when schools were closed. And then the final thing that people obviously think about is grandparents and others who are potentially at risk. And obviously there is an issue there which we need to think through in certain cases, and that's about people taking sensible decisions. So I think, I fully understand, as everyone fully understand, people wanting to think this through. But the point I want to go back to at the beginning is that the biggest concern for people is going to be the health of their children. And this is a disease which can affect children, but is very unlikely to compared to adults.
Thanks very much, Chris. Can we go to Marco Varvello of Raiuno? Mark.
Thank you, Prime Minister. Actually, I must thank you on behalf of the Foreign Press Association as well, which advocated for a while access to these daily briefings. And here we are. Thank you very much, Prime Minister. My questions are about the quarantine, because it's not just a matter of summer holidays. Hundreds of thousands of European workers left the country because of the lockdown, because shopping center, restaurant, pizzeria, they're all closed, so no work anymore. Now they are ready to come back. So I just wonder, they're not all key workers in NHS, but actually they are quite essential. If you think of any alternative, different way from the quarantine, health certificate or anything else. The second question, because you mentioned, the Home Secretary mentioned as well, air bridges and travel corridors. Does it mean that the British government has got already ongoing bilateral negotiation with the single European countries, and in case, which ones?
Okay, well, Marco, thank you very much. On the air corridors, I don't want to go into the negotiations that we're having, but clearly we're discussing with our partners around the whole of Europe about what could be done continuously, just as we've been negotiating the whole time about movements across borders, and it's one of the most difficult things to get right. And what I'd say to our Italian friends, Italians who've been living and working in the UK, who now want to come back, I say come back. tutti benvenuti. Come back to London or to the UK, but you've got to quarantine. And I don't believe that is, everybody's been in lockdown for a long time. I know it's an imposition, but we've really got to defeat this virus. But we want you back.
Well, that was the Prime Minister Boris Johnson appearing at the government's daily news briefing alongside the Chief Medical Officer and the Chief Scientific Advisor. We're going to leave that there because we want to speak to the Chair of the Health Select Committee, Jeremy Hunt. Today, they've been speaking to the head of the UK's Test and Trace programme, who said she hopes to start publishing data from next week on the number of people tested with their contacts traced within 24 hours. Baroness Dido Harding was being questioned by MPs on the Health and Social Care Select Committee, where she was challenged for not revealing the numbers sooner. Chair of that Health Select Committee, Jeremy Hunt, joins me now. Good afternoon to you, Mr. Hunt. I want to come on to the evidence you heard from Dido Harding in just a moment. First, what we've just heard from the government at the Daily News Conference, 359 deaths across all settings announced by the Prime Minister. New cases a day, 1,871, but as we heard from Sir Patrick Vallance, that thought to be more like 8,000 cases. That number of deaths, 359. When you look at our European neighbours, that is still very high, isn't it? More than 3 times higher than France, which is at the top of that table. So many countries, including Spain, recording 0 daily deaths. So why are we still in this situation now?
I think it's a difficult question to answer because we've had slightly different responses to the pandemic to other countries, and also we're at a slightly different stage. But I think all that will become, that's analysed a great deal when we've all passed through it. But I think the most significant thing is that statement that we heard this afternoon from Sir Patrick Vallance, that he thinks that around 8,000 people a day are still catching the virus for the first time. That says it is still very much alive in this country. And if we're going to control it with the new test and trace process, we really need to be contacting all those 8,000 people, making sure that they're isolated, making sure they then tell us who they've been near so that we can isolate their contacts. And that's going to be the key if we're going to get this under control.
Yeah, test and trace only works when the infection rate is low enough for those contacts, each of those people infected and all of their contacts to be traced, doesn't it? We heard from Sir Patrick Vallance that the R rate still relatively close to 1. It isn't coming down fast. There is relatively little room for manoeuvre. Why then have we had this easing of lockdown, shielded people being told it's okay to go out, larger gatherings in gardens as well as in parks, schools returning, etc., when the numbers aren't coming down, as we heard from the scientists there, as fast as they would like?
Well, it's an incredibly difficult judgment for any Prime Minister to make. And I've always thought that the real deadline is actually the beginning of July, because that's when he said he was hoping that everyone would be able to get their kids back to school and therefore everyone would be able to go back to work. So I think the next 4 weeks is absolutely essential for this. What we heard this afternoon was a very important bit of information from Professor Fraser from Oxford University, who said that if you want the test and trace process to work, there is a golden 48 hours. So that for example, if you have coronavirus symptoms, it takes 48 hours before anyone you've been near starts to infect other people. So what that means is you've got to get the test result back in 24 hours, and then you've got to contact and isolate everyone you've been near in 24 hours. Now, that is clearly not happening at the moment, and I think that's why the government doesn't want to release the data. But getting the track and trace system to work within that golden 48 hours is going to be central to its success, and that's what we have to make happen this month.
You mentioned there the government's reluctance to release the data. The Prime Minister has been asked repeatedly about it during Prime Minister's questions today, also during the news conference there. You questioned Dido Harding on this earlier at the Select Committee. All we're told is that thousands of people who are isolating who wouldn't have been before this service started operating, but no data, because they said the data isn't in a state yet to be presented. They want to get it official from the UK Statistics Authority. But from what you're suggesting, it's because the data doesn't look good.
Well, that's what I'm worried about. And I think they do need to start publishing this data because, this is absolutely central to our ability to tackle the virus. And I think we've got to be reasonable back and say that this was a system that was set up from scratch, standing start, over a period of 4 to 5 weeks. They only started at the beginning of last month. And so things are not going to be perfect first time around. There are going to be plenty of teething problems. But we need to see the data and we need to see things moving in the right direction. And in particular, it has been taking much too long to get test results back. That's the thing that I think is most critical at the moment. So I've asked Baroness Harding to supply the data within the next week. And I very much hope she'll do that so that we can see where we're at now and start to see over the next few weeks this system being knocked into shape.
Yeah, you got a concession from the Prime Minister and Prime Minister's questions that there would be a 24-hour turnaround on all tests by the end of the month. But that's still a long way off, isn't it? By which time many more people will have been infected. He had promised a world-beating test, track and isolate system. We don't have the app yet. We don't have any data on how the Isle of Wight pilot is going. We have no data on the numbers of people being traced and their contacts. We have contact tracers saying they're twiddling their thumbs. It's far from well-beating, isn't it? And there is a suspicion that this was rushed out in the wake of the Dominic Cummings scandal. Do you share that suspicion that Test and Trace was launched before it was ready as a deflection?
Well, we needed to get on with this anyway. So I don't complain about the fact that it's, they're rushing ahead with it because, the sooner we do this, the better. What I would like to see now is less focus on the number of tests done every day. We had the 100,000 test target, the 200,000 test target. The most important thing we need to know is of the 8,000 to 9,000 people being tested or catching coronavirus every day, what proportion of them are we finding out? What proportion of them are we getting to isolate? What proportion of them are we tracking down their close contacts? That's the thing that will make the biggest difference if we want to stop a second wave. That's what they've done in Taiwan. We heard from the former Vice President of Taiwan this afternoon. They've only had 7 deaths in total in Taiwan, and they're right next door to mainland China. So that is why this is the right system to do. But it's less about big test number targets. It's more about an end-to-end process where we can be certain that if someone in your town or your village or your city gets coronavirus, we find out about it, they're tested, everyone they've been near is tested, isolated. That's the process that needs to happen.
Can I ask you about moves on quarantine to begin from next week for people arriving in the UK? We heard from Sir Patrick Vallance just then that the sage advice on quarantine is that measures are most effective when applied when the infection rate is very low and applied to countries with higher rates. The question that raises is why is this being done now and not before when our infection rate was much lower than other countries? Why is it being done now?
Well, I think there are going to be lots of lessons that we learn at a later stage as to whether we did things early enough. And certainly in Korea and Taiwan, locking down the borders is one of the very first things that they did. And I'm sure that we will learn from what they've done. But it was quite interesting this afternoon. The government's getting quite a lot of stick for this at the moment. But the former Vice President of Taiwan said that Taiwan still insists on all international arrivals quarantining for 2 weeks. And they are one of the most advanced countries in the world when it comes to fighting, or one of the most advanced places in the world when it comes to fighting coronavirus. So I think, this is obviously a very, very difficult call because of the impact it has on the economy. And I think
what we must hope is that we find a way of modifying this measure with countries that have low infection rates, the air bridge concept. Maybe what we have to do is have a very developed test and trace process for people who arrive in the UK, so that we know where they are, we can get them tested, and we can track it that way. I think we have to be open to all sorts of innovations, because obviously it is very, very damaging to the economy if people have to quarantine if they arrive here.
Sam, we are almost out of time. I do just want you to put your former Foreign Secretary hat on for a moment to ask you about the situation in Hong Kong. Boris Johnson telling China he will change the visa system unless it backs down. Your response to that?
Well, it's a very big thing to do, and I think that the Prime Minister has been very bold. Immigration is a very sensitive issue, and this is potentially offering a route to citizenship for nearly 3 million people. But he's done it, and he's done it because he's sending a signal to China that we take that agreement signed by Margaret Thatcher in 1984 that guaranteed Hong Kong would have a high degree of autonomy, something that would be badly undermined by this new law that China is proposing. We take that agreement very seriously, and we're the only country that China signed that agreement with. They didn't sign it with America or Germany or France, they signed it with us. So we are treating our obligations to the people of Hong Kong who previously lived under British rule very seriously, and I think it's a very welcome
Thank you very much indeed. I'm sorry to interrupt you. Thank you for your time. This is Sky News. It is 6 o'clock. I'm Sarah Hewson. Coming up in the next 60 minutes. Don't get carried away. The public warned not to gather indoors in a cautious COVID update.
We're fighting an invisible enemy, and no one is safe, frankly, until we're all safe.
Also at 6, London crowds confront police outside the gates of Downing Street amid protests over the death of a US black man. As the family of George Floyd pay an emotional visit to the site where he lost his life. Critics call UK quarantine plans a blunt tool as the government sets out a timetable for travellers. The moment one NHS worker sees her daughters again for the first time in 9 weeks.
Well, guys, we're going to have to end it here. Thanks for joining me. Give it a like, give it a comment, and share it with your friends, and I'll catch you in the next video, and I'll do some videos later. Peace.
Night, as he used his daily news briefing
Thank you,
to
plead
with the public not to get carried away.